The cabin had felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside, like something was waiting. All day, I felt eyes on me, hidden in the trees, watching. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me, but by nightfall, the forest came alive with noises that set my nerves on edge, branches snapping, low growls in the distance, something moving just out of sight. My heartbeat seemed to match the rhythm of the woods, every sound amplified in the growing darkness. Exhausted, I finally drifted into a restless sleep until a blood-curdling screech ripped through the night. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal either. I shot up, heart pounding, the screech growing closer, more frenzied. Alone, with no cell reception, I made a reckless choice. I had to know what it was. I crept toward the door, every footstep feeling too loud in the eerie stillness. The screeching suddenly stopped as my hand hovered over the door handle. The forest, usually full of life, went deathly silent. No wind, no insects, just nothing. My blood ran cold. I dared a glance out the window expecting to see an empty yard. But I didn't. Staring back at me were two glowing eyes, high off the ground. The outline of a massive, unnatural figure barely visible in the shadows. It was watching me, waiting. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, the bear spray in my hand feeling laughably inadequate. Every creak of the floorboards now felt like a warning, every shadow a threat. I retreated to the bedroom, feeling the walls close in, praying that whatever it was would lose interest.
The old house had been abandoned for decades, its skeletal frame shrouded in fog. On a dare, my friends and I decided to explore it one night. As we stepped through the rotting front door, an icy draft sent shivers down my spine. The silence was oppressive, almost suffocating. We split up, each taking a floor. Drawn by a faint whisper, I found myself descending into the basement. The light from my flashlight barely cut through the darkness, revealing walls covered in yellowed photographs with unnerving, twisted smiles. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, sending my heart racing. In the basement's far corner, I spotted a dusty mirror. My own reflection stared back, but something was horribly wrong. My reflection's eyes were wide with a sinister glee, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. I spun around, but the basement was empty. My breath quickened as the reflection began to speak, its voice a distorted echo of my own, reciting my darkest fears. The basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging me into absolute darkness. I pounded on the door, my screams merging with the whispers that now filled the room. Frantically, I turned back to the mirror. It was no longer just me. It was now crowded with shadowy figures reaching out, their hands extending toward me. My flashlight flickered and died. I was left in pitch black, my own voice coming from the mirror, warped and distant, pleading for help. Cold, unseen hands grabbed me, pulling me towards the mirror. Each night, plugging in my phone charger had become a ritual, one last task before surrendering to sleep. I could do it with my eyes closed. Almost. But tonight, something was off. I fumbled in the dark, reaching down the side of the bed for the elusive plug. My fingers brushed the cold metal prongs, but missed the outlet sliding against the wall. I cursed under my breath and tried again. This time, my hand slipped deeper into the shadows beneath the bed. I froze. Something cold and dry brushed against my fingertips. Shaking off the unsettling sensation, I convinced myself it was just the blanket. I tried again, but the plug seemed to vanish from my grasp. Annoyed, I leaned over and reached further under the bed, determined to find it. That's when I felt it, fingers, thin and bony, curling around my wrist. I yanked my hand back, heart racing, but the grip tightened. The strength was unmistakable. I was held fast, nails biting into my skin. Panic surged through me as I realized this was no trick of the mind. Slowly, with trembling breath, I forced myself to look. A face stared back at me from the darkness, pale and gaunt, eyes wide and bloodshot. His lips cracked into a smile that revealed yellowed teeth. "I've been waiting," he whispered, voice raspy and hollow, for you to finally notice me. The night was quiet, the only sounds being the gentle lapping of water against the boat and the occasional croak of a distant frog. I cast my line, hoping for a peaceful evening. The moon was a thin crescent, offering little light, but that suited me fine. The darkness was calming. As I sat there staring at the ripples in the water, I noticed something strange. A shadow darker than the surrounding water, moving just beneath the surface. It circled the boat slowly, deliberately. My pulse quickened. I leaned over the edge, squinting to see what it was. The water seemed to churn where the shadow moved. Suddenly, something breached the surface, glinting, wet, and impossibly large. It wasn't a fish. A sickening feeling gripped my stomach as I realized it was a hand with long, bony fingers that ended in jagged claws. It reached for the side of the boat, pulling with a strength that rocked the vessel. I stumbled backward, heart pounding. The boat lurched as the thing below tried to pull itself up. I grabbed an oar, swinging it wildly, but the hand retreated, leaving deep gouges in the wood. The shadows submerged again, circling, waiting. The boat was small, the shore far away, and whatever was in the water wasn't done with me yet. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth as I made my way through the forest. The sun was setting, casting long shadows between the trees, but I was close to home. I should have felt at peace, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I quickened my pace, but the sound of footsteps behind me matched my speed. Every time I turned around, there was no one there, only the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But I knew I wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest. Ahead, I saw the stream, its cold water rushing over slick stones. I had crossed it 100 times before, but now it seemed like an impassable barrier. I could hear the person behind me closing the distance. Without thinking, I jumped into the stream, feeling the icy water soak my shoes and pull at my legs. The current was stronger than I remembered, and the rocks beneath my feet were slippery. I stumbled but managed to keep my balance, half running, half swimming to the other side. I glanced back. On the far bank, a shadowy figure stood at the water's edge, watching me. The darkness obscured their features, but I could feel their gaze burning into me. I didn't wait to see if they would follow. I turned and fled into the trees, the forest closing in behind me. My grandma used to tell me about one of her aunts. They lived in Laos during the Secret War. Her aunt started talking with one of the American soldiers, and he started learning basic Hmong. After some time, though, he stopped showing up. The basic consensus was that he was dead, but she kept waiting for him. When things got really bad and the bombs started dropping, they fled to the caves for shelter. One night, as everyone is sleeping, my grandma hears a familiar voice. It's the soldier. He's mumbling in a very broken Hmong, "I'm back for you," over and over again. Her eyes are still closed until she feels something reach out and grab her shoulder and slowly move down to her hand. When it reached her hand, she said it wasn't a human hand at all, but like a large animal paw. She briefly opened her eyes to see a dark figure, clearly not human though, standing over her. Then she heard her aunt get up. Something was said, but she couldn't make out what it was. The figure then left and the aunt followed. This was still in the middle of the night, mind you. The aunt was never seen again. The story is that the dead soldier came back to take her with him, or something else imitated him in order to take her. Edit. To clarify the story, the paw touched my grandma. I don't know why it touched her first. She knows it happened because they were all hiding, sleeping in the cave together. My house was built in 1904. I have been living here for about 12 years. Of all the weird things that my siblings and I have seen or heard in this house, this one event is my favorite. This happened to my brother. About 10 years ago, my brother and his best friends had started a garage band. His friends could only get together on Sunday afternoons. They would practice into the early evening and usually called it quits by 8 p.m. This was the time I usually left the house because I worked the graveyard shift. This happened in late fall, so the days were getting shorter. They had just finished a long session when the decision to head to someone else's house came about. My brother handed his car keys to his buddy so they could load up the equipment. Everyone had filed out of the basement. The tricky part was that they needed to walk all the way to the back of the basement, up the back stairs, through the kitchen doorway, down the hall into the living room, and out into the front porch. Everyone was outside sitting in my brother's truck waiting for him. My brother was walking up the back stairs when he remembered that he had left his pancakes in a to-go container sitting on a speaker in the basement. He made the decision to go back. Now the basement is not clean. With full sight lines, there had been partitions made. So after my brother walks back, he is about to grab his food container, when out of the corner of his eye he sees it. It is a shadowy figure, right at his peripheral vision. This feeling of dread and uneasiness washed over my brother. We had been taught that if you are in the presence of a spirit or ghost and you felt a bad vibe, to say quick prayer or to cuss at it. My brother basically just said, "Hey, fuck you. I don't have time for this shit." My brother started to walk to the back of the basement and briskly up the stairs, closing doors and turning off lights as he was walking out. The last light switch is on the opposite side of the front door. Luckily, the door was open, and the light from the street lamp was flooding the living room with its amber light. My brother said he felt something at his back, but at no point did he turn around. As he flicked the last switch, the living room went dark, as the rest of the house. As he stepped out, he pulled on the door, closing it behind him. He walked towards the front gate. Our house resides far from the main street, essentially having a large front yard. As he closed the gap between himself and his friend, laden truck, he kind of smiled and thought things over in his head, mad at himself for spooking out when there was no reason. He climbed into the driver's side of the truck, putting on his seatbelt and getting ready to pull out of the parking spot directly in front of the house, when one of his friends asked, "Hey, wait, what about your brother? Isn't he coming with us?" My brother answered, "What do you mean? He went to work early tonight. He is already gone. Do you see his car anywhere?" The next question they asked, "So then who was walking behind you when you were leaving the house?" We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her two brothers were home alone, while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they didn't have electricity. It had been dark outside for about an hour, and my aunt and my uncles were getting ready for bed. Outside, they heard noises, as if someone moving things around outside. My oldest uncle went to look out the front window and saw a figure out by the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary, because the closest neighbor was miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through the personal items that my family had left in the vehicle. My aunt and uncles were frightened by the sight and knew that they should take action. They took out the rifle and all steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door and aimed the gun at the dark figure. The figure turned and started to walk towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. The figure drew closer, and my aunt began to smell something like a rotting corpse. It was so strong it made her gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger with no luck, and the figure came closer and closer. Off the distance, headlights were coming up the road. My grandparents were returning. The figure looked toward the lights and started to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the house. My oldest uncle ran toward the truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. The thing was poking out its head to observe what they were doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove and grabbed a handful of ashes and rubbed over the gun and placed a ash-covered bullet into the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired toward the tree. Whatever that thing was didn't expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed and the dark figure began running. My grandma chased my aunt inside, and my uncles and my grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit the figure, he saw a woman. Not only that, whoever it was running on all fours like a bear. My grandfather eventually stopped the truck, and as they neared the ditch that drops about 20 feet, he got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and that he knew it was her and to leave his family alone. A few days passed and there was news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the skinwalker is, say their name and it will kill them.